This is When Dragons Came to Alice Street, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Chapter 4, A Conversation on an Iceberg. Their journey on the third day seemed to fly by even faster than the second day. It was as if the farther south they flew, farther from human society, the more the dragons gained power. Storms passed beneath them in a whoosh of gray and white, and then there was sparkling blue again, hurtling by faster than a jet plane. But snug on the dragons' magical backs, they felt no wind at all. It was as if they traveled in an enchanted bubble. Soon icebergs began to appear below, little ones at first, and then vast palaces of blue and white, as luminous as opals in the blue light, catching fire in shafts of sunlight. Other icebergs sparkled like diamonds. One had a perfect melting circular arch with penguins clustered below it. Another, with a little flat lip of ice near the sea's surface, had some sleeping seals on it. One was so incredibly large that it floated upon the sea like an island, with steep walls of ice almost a quarter of a mile high, and the flat top that extended for a white, icy 2 miles. A jet plane could have landed on it with room to spare. Wow, James breathed, and then again, wow, about 100 times. Stop saying wow, Tim complained. You sound like a little dog. Grrr, said James. They came at last to an iceberg more amazing than any of the rest. It was a floating island of arches and dips and even melting blue lakes. And at one end there was a tall, arching hollow of blue ice like curving glass, over 60 feet high. Here, unexpectedly, the two dragons circled and banked and came in for a landing. When the children had dismounted, the dragons crunched over to that icy overhang and settled neatly side by side, lying on their feet exactly like two lordly chickens, their toes just visible beneath their chests in tidy little lines. They even preened their wings and looked very happy to be taking a rest. The children uncramped their limbs and looked dubiously at their feet, trying not to imagine the miles of ocean water not so very far below the white surface they stood on. "We need to talk to you," Gorwin said at last, "before the last section of your journey." "Before you help the whales," Ganduina explained. The children looked at each other. The flight across the Pacific Ocean had been so wonderful they had almost forgotten the reason the dragons had asked them to come along in the first place. How in the world could a bunch of kids from Alice Street help even one single little whale? They were in a world of ice and snow and surging bitter cold waves. Their feet were already getting cold just standing on the iceberg, and Jackie's teeth had begun to chatter. "I can't even swim," Tim pointed out. The rest of them looked at him in sudden alarm. Were the dragons about to ask them to swim? Visions of ducking through icy waves with a knife in their teeth and cutting ropes or something came to all of them. Could that be what the whales wanted of them? Only Sergio and Brenda could swim in water over their heads, and that was in the public pools and warm, quiet coves of sunny California. "Pull up a seat," Garwin said grandly, like a king in his hall. They looked around dubiously. "What seats?" Brenda asked. "Roll the snow into a ball." Ganduina lifted her chin to point. "It snowed here last night. You can make your own seats." Experimentally, Tim scratched out a little snowball and set it down on the ground. He rolled it forward for a distance with his toe. the way he had seen in a movie about making snowmen. Lo and behold, it got bigger, picking up more snow as it rolled. He got serious and began to push it along with both hands, and was gratified to see that it rapidly expanded in size. The other children took the hint, and soon they were all rolling little expanding balls of snow in all directions. Marina got tired first and sat down decisively on hers before it was strong enough, and the whole thing smashed back into loose snow beneath her. Her feet flew up over her head so high, she ended up doing a complete somersault and sitting on her knees. And they were all so surprised they couldn't help but laugh. said Marina indignantly, but then saw how funny it was and began to laugh too. Brenda helped her pack together the little pile and start again. Soon they were all seated on a line of comfortable snow seats facing the dragons. "We are going to tell you," Gorwin began, and then he stopped as an emperor penguin popped out of the sea and waddled over directly in front of Jackie, the first one in the line of snow seats that he came to. Staring up at her as if she was the most amazing, marvelous thing he had ever seen, he made a small interrogative squawk, as if he were asking a question. "Shh!" Jackie reproved him. "Gorwin is talking." The penguin squatted and made a poop and waddled on, walking like a little upright man in a tuxedo who had his feet tied together with his shoelaces. Ew! Sergio stood up to kick some snow on top of the little white and yellow blob the penguin had deposited. When he was at last settled on his seat again, Gorwin started once more. "We're going to tell you about the king of the whales." "Well, tell us already," James interrupted. "You keep telling us you're going to tell us, and then something else happens." The other children all shushed him. "Let him talk," Sergio said. When they were all quiet again, Gorwin started once more. "It's not something I can tell you all at once in a sentence. I can't tell you to run over there and push a button on the TV like you do at home or dial 911. This is a bit more complicated." "Yes, dear." Even Gondwina was getting impatient with all these prefaces to talking. "We'll listen to whatever you tell us, but I'm sure, but just tell us. No more beating around the bush." Gorwin looked confused, looking around as if in search of bushes. Gondwina sighed deeply. Go on, dear. I'm sorry I interrupted you." Gorwin made a shrugging, startling over kind of movement as if he had been a bird, or if he had been a bird, he would have ruffled his feathers. "As I was saying," he began again, in his gruff dragon voice, "the story of how you must help begins with the story of the blue whales." Gondwina rolled her eyes, but managed to stay mute. "Now, the blue whales, as you no doubt have heard, are the greatest of all the whales. So great, so grand, so long, and so heavy. They are like islands in the sea, 90 feet long. They have astonished all who gaze on them for all the millennia they have wandered in the oceans. The greatest of them all, Horus, is known throughout whaledom as the King of Wales. He is vast as an island and old as the world. Indeed, I think he is part of the magical world, like dragons." The children were all frowning now. What could the bigness of blue whales have to do with anything? Or even an extra big old whale called Horus? But no one dared to ask Gorwin to be briefer at this point. "Without the blue whales," Gorwin said tragically, All the other whales in the world would be forever out of balance and not feel right about themselves or know how to carry on. And alas, there are very few blue whales left anywhere. This seemed to sadden him so much. A big dragon tear slipped out of his eye. Ganduina, being a thoughtful mate, took over the conversation to let him recover. "Does anyone have any conversations or any questions so far?" she asked. "Yes," Tim said immediately. "Do blue whales eat people?" Gorwin's eyes rose in astonishment, and he even let out a great hiccup of a laugh. "Eat people? What an idea!" Tim scowled. It was embarrassing enough to ask a question without people making fun of it. "No, dear," Ganduina assured him without any hint of criticism in her voice. "Although they are the biggest creatures upon the earth, indeed the biggest creatures who ever lived, the blue whales eat only tiny shrimp and plankton called krill. They just scoop them in when they take an enormous mouthful of water and filter them out." "As I said, the very biggest and oldest of the blue whales," Garwin continued with his story, "is Horace, the king of whales." "Is he here?" Brenda breathed. "Don't interrupt," Gorwin snapped, as if a dragon can snap. He was feeling a little testy about everyone trying to hurry him up, and now they wouldn't even let him tell the story properly. "Sorry," Brenda apologized. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and sat up straight like she did in school. "To make a long story short, something very unusual is happening here in Antarctica, and it has put the blue whales, including Horace, in great danger." He had their full attention now. "Because the world is warming so fast. The ice has begun to melt. Even the endless sheets of ice 2 miles thick that make up much of the coastline of Antarctica are melting. Every year the blue whales come to a very large bay near here to feed on their krill. It is the time of the year when they must eat enough to last 6 months. For when they leave here to start traveling, they only rarely get to eat more. It is very important to them." He looked around severely to see if anyone was planning to interrupt him again, but they all sat straight and mum as people in a church. "1 month ago," Gorwin went on, "a huge piece of ice came loose from the continent of Antarctica. It began as a sheet of ice as big as one of the smaller states of the United States, as big as a very large island. Over many months it continued to melt, and the waves jostled the edges of it, and pieces fell off as it moved along the coast. At last it moved across the mouth of the bay, where the blue whales come each summer to find their krill. A storm was moving across the sea and pushed all the ice floes very fast. Little by little, while the whales were feeding and not paying attention, the way out of the bay was closed up until at last there was no way out at all." Everyone sighed, imagining the trapped whales. "Can't they just swim beneath the ice?" Brenda asked. She read a lot and knew that whales can swim very deep. Gorwin shook his head slowly back and forth. "Even whales must breathe every so often. The distance they would have to travel to take the next breath is too far. They cannot make it out without help." All the children were frowning now as he explained more of the problem, their eyebrows sinking deeper and deeper towards their noses. How in the world did Gorwin think 5 children from Alice Street could cut a passage through an island of ice? But what can we do? Marina finally interrupted him, voicing the thought they all had. Gorwin looked pleased this time. I was hoping you would ask that. As it happens, the whales are not entirely alone in this region of the sea. Marina looked over at the penguin, now preening a friend who had waddled up beside him. Gorwin sighed. No, nothing that lives here can cut through the ice until it is ready to move of its own accord. But there are 2 icebreakers near here. Powerful big ships, armored with heavy steel prows, designed just for breaking through the kind of ice that is blocking the escape of the blue whales. However, his voice trailed off. Ganduina took over. However, she said softly, those ships did not come here to save the whales. They came here to kill the whales. They are whaling ships with terrible explosive harpoons set on the decks and big knives which they plan to use to cut the whales into pieces so they can sell them as human and pet food at home. That's totally terrible, Tim announced with conviction. Whales are smart. Of course they are, Gondwina nodded. They are friends of ours, and they would likely be friends of human beings too if you took time to introduce yourselves properly, Gondwina said. But people have hunted whales for so long that now even whale hunters generally agree there are simply too few to continue. They just seem to have a hard time stopping. However, there is another ship near the whale hunters, a smaller vessel which other people have sent to try to stop the whalers and make it difficult for them to catch the whales. Ah, all the children said in unison, but then looked confused again. We still don't understand, Brenda said, speaking for all of them. How can we possibly help? And the dragons told them. Chapter 5. The Magic of Dragon Goop. The dragons took off again as soon as everyone had had a snack of everything that was left in their pockets from the cruise ship and the mango trees. The sun was high in the sky, and on the dragon's back they were warm and comfortable. Now, as you may have heard, the sun doesn't always set properly in the far south of the world. When people on Alice Street are telling each other, oh, good, it's almost summer, scientists in snowbound huts near Antarctica are telling each other, oh, no, it's almost winter. And not only that, but the daylight in winter gets less and less each day until at last there's only night all the time, with stars out, and only the shimmering Arctic lights and the moon to see by. On the other hand, in the Antarctic summer, when things are just the opposite, night goes away for almost 3 months, and it's sunny all the time. This story takes place during such a non-stop sunny time, just in case you were wondering. The children caught sight of the whale-killing ships far below them, just a half hour after taking off from the iceberg. The dragons were flying very high, and the long armored metal vessels looked like tiny pretend ships painted on a wide blue and white plate. To the men on the ships below, of course, the dragons were invisible. Tim wondered if he and the other children were invisible too while they were on their backs. If they weren't, they must certainly have looked very silly straddling invisible dragon necks high in the clouds. But fortunately, no one looked up or noticed. Very gradually, gliding in lazy circles, the dragons, with the children holding on tight, began to descend closer and closer to the cruel-looking gray ships. As had happened before, all the crewmen, working at various places inside the ship and on the open deck, fell gently to sleep where they worked. According to plan, Sergio and Brenda and Jackie got off on one ship. Tim and James and Marina got off on the other. This time, there would be no time for playing. They had a very particular job to do. According to Brenda, who told me about it later, Sergio took the lead on the first ship. There was a ladder leading from the deck where the dragon lightly touched down to drop them off. Taking firm hold of the metal rungs, he began to climb toward the wheelhouse far above, and then thought better of it. He stepped back down on the deck. "You go first," he said to Brenda. "Jackie can go between us, and I can catch you guys if you fall." At first, Brenda said, she was annoyed. Didn't he think they could climb just as well as he could? But when she thought about it later, she told me she also appreciated his looking out for them, even if he did call them guys sometimes. The captain was in the wheelhouse when at last they reached it, clambering up and into the door one by one. "Don't look down," Sergio ordered. The view back down the ladder from the wheelhouse was very scary. They were at least 3 stories up above the deck below and could see far out over the dark, cold water and the distant line of ice that marked the sealed-off bay where the whales were trapped. They could also see the cruel harpoon gun mounted on the very front of the boat, and Brenda shuddered to see it. She looked down to see if Jackie had noticed and found her staring at it. She wondered how much her sister knew about how whales are hunted, but was afraid to ask. They examined the seamen slumped over their instruments in the whale room one by one. None was the captain. Sergio led the way through a door and into a hallway lit by a single bulb. A door to a large cabin stood open at the end. Brenda and the others were delighted to see the word "Captain" painted clearly above the door in fine old-fashioned letters. "Here he is!" Sergio crowed triumphantly and beckoned to the others as he stepped through the door. The captain had been, most conveniently, already taking a nap when the magic sleep came over the crew, and he still lay comfortably on his bed, all 7 feet of him. He was a very tall Russian, with a gray-black beard and a giant handlebar mustache under a hooked nose and long wispy eyebrows to boot. "Where's the stuff?" Brenda whispered. The dragons had given them some dry, gritty stuff which they had called, with great dignity, special dream dust. "It's special dream dust," Sergio corrected her, "not stuff." "It is so stuff," Brenda said defiantly. "In fact, it's just dried eye goop. I saw them making it." "Dragons have eye goop too?" Jackie looked interested. "Ew!" "Dragons are magical creatures," Sergio argued. "So it's not just goop, it's special." He carefully unwrapped the discarded flap of dry skin the dragons had put dream dust in, and sprinkled the dust above the captain's eyes as the dragons had directed them. This task, however, turned out to be more challenging than he had expected. Every time the captain snored out, His handlebar mustache and his long, drooping eyebrows flew upward, cleaning most of the dust away each time like built-in windshield wipers. Brenda had a better idea. She dipped her forefinger into the remaining dust and then rubbed it very gently along the man's eyelids, barely touching them. He stirred for a minute, and they all froze. But then he went deeply back to sleep. When they were sure it was safe again, Sergio nodded to the others, and everyone stood very still. "The whales are on the other side of the bay ice," he said to the sleeping captain in a deep, slow tone of voice, paying careful attention to repeat all the words just as the dragons had instructed them. All three said it together the second time, chanting in unison. The whales are on the other side of the bay ice. It came out a little hoarsely, but they got smoother and smoother as they said it many times. The captain's eyebrows rose and fell of their own accord, and he began to smile as if he were having the most marvelous dream. "The whales are on the other side of the bay ice," they chanted, tapering their voices lower and lower as the captain began to look like he had received the finest Christmas present, and even muttered something that sounded sort of grateful. Jackie went up close and studied him wonderingly. "I think it worked," she said. "I think you're right," Brenda said. Sergio packed away the last of the dust and opened the door into the passageway again. "Let's get back to the wheelhouse," he said. "We have just one more thing to do here." Tim told me that he and James and Marina were having a more difficult time on their boat. For the longest time, they couldn't find anyone who looked like a captain anywhere. They crept through hallways and up and down stairs, from the wheelhouse to the engine room, looking in all the cabins. It was Marina who figured out where he was at last. "Look," she said, as they passed through the cafeteria for the third time. On the wall above the dining tables, there was a picture of a man who was clearly the captain. The cook was happily snoring just below it on the floor. "How's that going to help? We can't influence the dreams of a picture of the captain," Tim said reasonably. "Yes, but look!" Marina pointed more insistently to the table next to the cook, where a man in a black jacket sat at a table. He had fallen asleep with his face pillowed right in the middle of his spaghetti noodles. He looked as happy as someone sleeping on a down pillow, although tomato sauce had trickled into his ears and bubbled around his nose when he breathed. "It's the captain," James whispered, looking back and forth from the picture on the wall to the man in the plate of spaghetti. Tim got closer and peered into the man's face and then up at the picture on the wall. "You're right," he announced, very much relieved. "Help me lay him on the floor." Working together, the three of them lifted the captain's face out of the spaghetti and slid him off his chair onto the floor. "Where's the goop stuff?" James asked. Tim unwrapped the package and dumped the whole pile of dragon eye goop dust right onto the man's face. He spluttered a little in his sleep, but seemed otherwise unaffected. "Okay, guys," Tim said. "Ready?" Together they chanted the same words that Sergio and Brenda and Jackie had chanted, with pretty much the same results. When they left, the captain was smiling peacefully, looking a bit strange, covered with dried tomatoes and dried eye goop, but a happy man, nevertheless, dreaming of a ship full of captured whales and the big bonus he would get when they got home. The dragons lifted the children off the decks again as soon as they came out, their pockets filled with sandwiches and fruit from the cafeteria. Then they hovered far above the ships, waiting to see if their plan would work. When the two dragons flew close together, Tim handed some sandwiches and a giant chocolate bar over to Sergio so they could eat something too. 15 minutes went by while they nibbled on lunch, but there was no movement below. "Corwin," Ganduina said as she swooped near, "I think perhaps you overdid the sleep spell a bit this time, dear." "Ah," Corwin said, looking sheepish. "I didn't want them to wake while the children were aboard." "Look," said Marina, "the captain we talked to is coming out. He's yelling at the men in the wheelhouse." "Ah," said Corwin, "that's better. Let's wait and see what they do now." It didn't take long to see the results of their work. There were men moving about on both ships now, and very shortly both icebreakers' engines had roared into life. Turning as one, they headed toward the ice, blocking the bay, and reached it within only a few minutes. "Wow," Tim breathed as the first ship impacted the ice. The massive steel prow of the icebreaker lifted up and crashed down, smashing the ice below like a huge hammer. There was a tremendous squealing and grinding as the ice gave way and slid along the sides. The ship rose again. And then for a long passage, the ice was thinner and the two ships just plowed through it, weaving around the big icebergs that rose and tipped like small floating mountains amid the flat sea ice, creating a winding mile-long channel of open water behind them. But they were not alone. Tim looked behind over Gorwin's back and was surprised to see a small ship enter the open channel behind them. This ship was clearly not an icebreaker. Could it be the ship that wanted to stop them? It was so small compared to the big icebreakers. Tim wondered what would happen if they followed the whale hunters into the icebound bay. Surely the ice might freeze up behind them. They could become trapped too. "Who are they, Corwin?" he asked. His dragon dipped his head under a wing and looked behind them. "Ah, good," said Corwin. "They found it." He would say no more. He only winked at Sergio as he flew by on Ganduina. Sergio looked very pleased with himself. "It's Greenpeace," he yelled across to Tim and James. "Corwin told me to send them a radio message." "What's Greenpeace?" Tim wanted to know. "Remember, the dragons explained it to us on the ice," Brenda said. "They are the ones who try to stop whaleboats from catching whales." Tim looked down skeptically at the little boat. What were they thinking? "Come on," Gorwin rumbled. "This ice-breaking business will take them a long time. It's time for you to meet Horace, the king of the whales." And that is the end of chapter 5. Look for the next chapter, chapter 6.